Well, welcome back to another session. I hope you were well. Today I'm going to be speaking to the topic which I think is at the heart of what I have been trying to share over the past many months. But today will be slightly different. I want to talk about how, despite the good intentions, how mothers, especially mothers in the West, have absolutely and utterly failed their daughters. Let me start by making it very clear. I was raised by a great mother, a woman I love very much, a woman who I hold in very high esteem. I have had the joy and the opportunity to have had my aunts and other women in my life, people who looked over me, people who raised me. And my mother was a great woman, but the whole adage that it takes a village to raise a child pertains to myself. I have and I owe a lot to the women who were certainly around me in my formative years, who were around me in my teenage years, and who were around me as I transitioned into an adult. And I am still very grateful for women who are around me and who continue to guide me even today. Women play a tremendous role in society, in the lives of both men and women. And today's session is not in any way or shape, in any form, an attack on mothers or women. I want to make that very, very clear before I start. Many years ago, I started teaching. And I started teaching because I came to a realization. I had come to a place in my life where I found that the knowledge that I had got me to where I was. But it wasn't sufficient to get me from where I was to where I wanted to be. As a matter of fact, I found myself in a ditch. And I started doing some searching, soul searching, as to my inadequacies. And rather than think about things from a position of morality, or rather than think of things introspectively and see myself as a victim, I asked a very simple question. What am I doing? What works? What doesn't work? And I placed all those questions, answers to those questions on one side. And then on the right side, on the other side, I asked a simple question. Where am I trying to get to? What is my true north? And I brought both together. The idea was very simple. Stop doing what is not working and focus on doing what works, but spend the most time you can in finding answers that will get you from where you are to where you want to get to. My father was a great man, an incredible father. And one of the things that I was taught was, firstly, part of the education system, was to be an educated person. You were not educated by simply the words and the training you went through as a child. An educated person is one who has developed the faculties of their mind in such a fashion and in such a manner that they can attain whatever goal they wish for themselves and their loved ones without interfering with the pursuits of other people. Education came from the word educo, to draw from within, to pull something out, rather than to stuff something in. And I was raised in a manner that I had to pull things out of myself. And my father did a great job, firstly providing that foundation for good education, teaching me all he had and knew, but instilling in me the curiosity to seek for other teachers and to find other voices of reason that could help me achieve my goals and dreams. And so I started at a time in my life where I realized that the knowledge I had got me to where I was. Now, all of that is simply the basis of what I'm trying to share today. We are stuck as a society, especially in the West. We're doing things very, very poorly. Not for not wanting to try harder, and not for a lack of ambition or a lack of ingenuity, but mostly because we have a software that is running our system, and that software was installed sometimes before we were born. And we don't know why we do what we do and why we continue to get the results that we get. And the reason is simply because the software is running at a subconscious level. Mothers fail their daughters, not because they intended to fail their daughters, but because they taught that the advice, the installation software that they were instilling in their daughters was what was necessary for success. Now, to understand this, it's important to recognize that we as human beings, we learn in two ways. We learn, the younger we are, from what we see, but we also learn from what we hear. Some people are able to combine both. And wherever there is a lack of congruency between what they see and hear, they lean to one side or the other. There are people who have done better by observation. There are people, therefore, who are modeling what they saw. There are other people who did better by what they heard and the absence of what was available by sight. In any case, today's session was inspired because I was having a conversation with some people, and I made reference to someone that we may know, not you, but in the group. And I made a statement. I said, well, our parents did the best that they could. They loved us. They gave us the best that they had. But in many cases, what they gave us fell short of what we needed to bridge the gap between where we were and where we wanted to get to. And we were not inspired or empowered with the knowledge to recognize that limitation in what was gifted to us by our parents. And for many of us, the feeling that you're going against what your father or your mother may have taught you drives a sharp knife behind your back. It's as though you're betraying your heritage, you're betraying your lineage. It's as though you're going against the grain, which is wrong, because life is supposed to be about learning and adapting, but most importantly, fulfilling that purpose for which you were born and moving towards that true north for which you aspire to be at or to arrive at. And that requires looking to the left and looking to the right and making sure that the way you're doing things is not the wrong way. You know, there's a saying to a man with a hammer: everything looks like a nail. A hammer is a great tool, but you cannot build a great house with just a hammer. You need other tools, and you need the skill sets to apply those tools in a manner that can create the beauty that you want. You and I were gifted with the best from our parents or our loved ones. We have learned differently, maybe from what you saw, maybe from what you heard, or maybe a combination. The most important question, however, is, was it sufficient? And as I look around, especially the United Kingdom, there's something starting to become more visible. The number of people who are between 30 and 45 who are unmarried is increasing at a rate that we've never seen in our history. Never. The number of people who are delaying marriage, people who are delaying starting a family, who are placing what I consider to be very trivial matters, such as education, and I'm talking about education from the perspective of going to college, and choosing degrees that are not really meaningful in society's development, such as the arts and humanities and the social sciences. Not all of them, some of them, rather than STEM, science, engineering, technology, math, is increasing at a rate where we genuinely have an issue. Most young women will tell you that they will not consider marriage or starting a family or getting married until close to 35. And so the question comes back, did our mothers, did they fail us? And are they failing us? And my conclusion has been that modern women were raised to be single and unmarried. They were raised not to be wives. They were raised not to know how to coexist and cooperate and get along with men. They were raised not to be humble. Perhaps the most important statement. They were raised not to be humble. But to understand the cause effects, let me take you back. A few generations. I have talked about the various generations that go back as far as the turn of the 20th century. From 1900 to 1925, we had what we call the Greatest Generation, or the Great Generation. These were people who saw the First World Wars. Incredible generation. Effectively, they died for what we have today and what we celebrate and value. Unfortunately, at that point in time, the physiological needs was the most important thing. We did not have the technology, and this is a difficult concept to get your head around, especially if you live in the West today. The idea that you didn't have abundance seems very foreign, but if you go back to the 1900s, there was almost nothing available. Abraham Maslow talked about a hierarchy of needs. At the bottom of the hierarchy of needs is the physiological needs: food, water, shelter. Above that hierarchy, what I call the first layer, is what we call your safety and security needs. Above that, the third, is love and belonging. Above that is self-esteem, and finally, the highest, number 4, if that's what the number is, self-actualization. And effectively, Abraham Maslow explained that as human beings, we begin at the bottom. And as we acquire our basic needs, we move up towards needs that are elective. In the early 1900s, the Greatest Generation, all they really focused on was physiological needs. But next to that was the safety needs and security needs. The Greatest Generation was between 1900 and 1925, or 24, whichever you choose. Usually there's a 1 to 2, 3 year lag between the generations. From 25 to 45 was what we call the silent generation. These were the people born to the Greatest Generation. They saw, depending on how early they were born, they saw the end of the World Wars, the First World War, but they saw the Second World War. They went through the Great Depression. This is a horrendous time. So if you were to take the Greatest Generation and the Silent Generation, they experienced poverty, hardship, wars, hunger, diseases, everything you can imagine, at a level where all of their focus was on how do we just eat, sleep, get water, and how do we survive. And then they had to contend with security as a result of the World War. So there was so much destruction that took place in human life, human ingenuity, human imagination and vision, and human desires. They raised their children, the baby boom generation, which was the generation that followed, to be like them. And this is where today's session really starts, because in having a conversation with the people that I spent time with and within this group, I asked a simple question. How old is your father? And how old is your mother? And how old is your father? And everyone would tell you. And I could see how, and I would ask them to describe their parents in their own words. And you could see how, depending on when you were born, and you might say the country that you were born into, an ideology, a philosophy, a principle of life was installed into you. The parents of the great and the silent were driven by, you might say, fear. There was this fear that you should save for the rainy day. You should put aside, a few eggs. Just don't put it all together. They had this fear that there would be another war. There'll be droughts and famine and hurricanes and diseases, whether that be a flu or something. And so there was always this caution on their part. And they instilled in their children very strong values. As a matter of fact, the Judeo-Christian values that we have today come as a result of what was transferred from the generations prior to those two generations. Amongst the people I interact with, there is a best fit line where we start to see deviations between those two great generations, silent and greatest, and the generations that followed, including mine. The baby boom generation was birthed from 1956 up until 1965. These were the children born to the silent generation. For the first time, we saw in the West abundance. We saw a transition. We saw a shift. The great innovations from the great generation and the silent generation, we started to see the benefits. We saw telephones connect with electricity, connect with transportation, and the Ford plants and the creation of cars. We saw agriculture, the fact that we did not need 100 people working to produce for 10% of that size. We could instead have 10% of 100 produced for 100 people due to technology, fertilizers, and innovation and all of that. It was a great boom. And for the first time, we had the Treaty of Versailles signed, and there was peace. And so the baby boom generation were raised with the same values, but they were gifted a lot more. The parents were able to transfer to their children all of the savings and the abundance and the heritage that came with character, values, morality, ethics, how to behave. For some reason, the baby boom generation, and it shouldn't come as a surprise. For some reason, this generation is my father's generation as well. Just to make it very clear, it's my father's generation. For some reason, those who were born in the West, who had seen so much life and opportunities and progress, sneered at their parents. They saw their parents, the silent generation, as backwards. And they wanted more, which is why, because they had been moved from Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, from the bottom to number 3, love and belonging. They rejected all the principles and all the philosophies and all the great inheritances of their parents. They said, no, we want love. We want to just have fun. We want a great time. And this is where today's session begins, because the mothers of that generation, what we found, and this is a sad reality, the Second World War caused so much loss of life in the West. And so many parents who survived, especially the mothers from the silent generation, lost their husbands as part of the Second World War. And they raised their children without a father in the house. Most baby boom generation, sons and daughters, did not have a father. They had stepfathers because their fathers sometimes died in wars, and stepfathers were available, or they just never had fathers. despite this, there was a transfer of some of the core principles of life, of how to have a good life and how to lead a good life. The baby boom generation rejected a lot of the ideas from their parents. Why? Because they had seen the improvements. They were more educated, there were no wars, there was peace, and we went through in the West decades of peace. And that changed. There was so much radical changes. There was all of the acts, civil rights that came into place, the suffragettes movement in the UK, the right to vote, the right of equality for women. We saw technological changes as part of that process, the invention of plumbing in mass scale, the introduction of plumbing and technology into office designs and building designs that women could then work. We saw the creation of the tampon that enabled women to be able to go a full day, especially during particular times of the year and the month, without needing any form of intense sanitary requirements relating to their periods. We also then saw, moving forward, the invention of the pill. We saw abortion being legalized, and we saw paternity being something that you could actually afford for the average person. So many technologies, and that changed radically the baby boom generation particularly. We saw the feminist movement come forward, the women's movement, and an ideology that seemed better than ideology from the two great generations and prior. In any case, I have gone through all of this to explain something, that there were unintended consequences of life events that were taking place. Absence of fathers in the house as a result of the wars, the emancipation, the exposure to new knowledge, the pursuit, having had the problem of security and safety solved, the pursuit of a greater life and more abundance. We saw the baby boom generation shun all of the great traits that their parents had. They were raised in the same manner. Many baby boom generations still behave in a similar manner, depending on when they were raised. If they were born, say, midway through the baby boom generation, towards the early stages, then they were very similar to their parents. In other words, the baby boom generation is 1946 to 1965. What you find is that people who were born up to 1950, 55, even within as far as 1958, 59, tended to be more traditional because they were very similar to their parents. The older ones were the ones that were more radical. These baby boom generations, both men and women, the ones that survived, where the men survived, had children, but they raised their children on the feminist ideology. They rejected everything from the past. They taught their daughters to reject the traditional gender roles, not to accept anything related to how society defined both responsibilities, roles, the reasons given for such roles, and the relationships in those roles. They said, reject it. You are not supposed to be a woman, and you're not supposed to be defined by the following X, Y, Z. So they simply said, no, forget this. We want you to be educated. We want you to be empowered, to be self-sustaining. Some of these women saw their mothers struggle with no men. They also saw their mothers struggle with the traditional gender roles and did not like it. So they taught their daughters to be everything that their parents were not. And they tried as much as possible to teach by words something different to what they were by actions. This is a key part of today's session, because this goes back to a conversation with my group and the people I was conversing with. One of them said something to me, well, how can you explain a deviation? There's a contradiction between what you're saying. And I said, no, in your particular case, it's a simple one. Look at your family. You are different to your siblings for a number of reasons. Number one, you saw and you learned by what was modeled. Your siblings learned by what was told. Big difference. This is a key part, that a lot of these baby boom parents rejected the ideology of their fathers and mothers, but they were raised in that way. So these were the parents who were educated but taught their daughters to be educated, strong, independent. The emphasis on not needing a man, the emphasis on being a lone ranger, the emphasis on being strong-minded and strong-willed, and perhaps the most frustrating part was a person of entitlement. Entitlement, where a lot of these women, here I come to my generation, you then come to Generation X, and some of these baby boom generation had children who were Generation Y, daughters and sons. Generation Y, you could say, were the ones who had moved. They'd seen some of the love and self experience based on the hierarchy of needs, love and belonging. But also then you started to move to the next stage, which is all about self-esteem. My generation, you tend to find a lot more people who are just about self-esteem, self and self and self, how I feel and how I feel and how I feel. You see this more in Generation Y, the generation that precedes, that succeeds my generation. Generation X was from 1966, and it extended. And the key part, and it varies, some people say 1980, some people say 1983, 84, but really this was at the peak of when we had hyperinflation in the West. At the time, we had Reagan and we had Thatcher who were leading the UK and the United States. I tend to draw the line roughly at 1983, possibly 84 in the West. For a number of reasons, we were delaying marriage, and so between, you might say, 66 and 1984, you have roughly, give or take, 18 years, which is about right. In any case, the next generation was the millennials, who extend up to about 2000 and perhaps 2005, 2006, and then you have Generation Z, who got to 2015, 2014, and then Generation A. In any case, what we've found is we've created a very serious issue, because from my generation, Generation X, all the way down to Generation A, the software installation amongst the women is markedly different to what the women of old used to have. Skip baby boom generation. And all of that software installation and the damage has come from the baby boom generation, my parents' generation. And I think strongly it will take years and decades to undo some of that damage. But fundamentally, let me address a few things. The women were raised to be modern women. This is where you had the liberation. We went through the sexual liberation, no doubt. The freedom was separated from the responsibility. Women were taught that choices do not have to come with constraints, and then there doesn't have to be costs, and there doesn't have to be consequences, and there are no trade-offs. And so what we found was this emancipation movement that was bordering on a focus on self. It was just about me. I'm going to say a few things as I go forward, which might come across as being harsh. I'd like you to judge for yourself. In any case, the focus on me took away the sense of the we. Greatest generation, silent generation, focused on the us and the we, which is why they sacrificed their lives on the beaches of Normandy, saved up, transferred all the wealth to their children, baby boom, who spent most of the money, very casually, who rejected all of the ideologies and all of the principles that they were given. And so from Generation X, my generation, you look at women who are, say, 40, late 40s, although Generation X extends beyond that, but a good point of reference is women who are 49 and below. And from 49, we go all the way down to about 26, 25. We've never had more women in that group who are unmarried, but not just unmarried, single, but not just single, who have no prospects of having an emotionally profound, significant relationship with someone they love, admire, care, value, and trust, and who they're willing to commit their lives to. Why? Because their mothers did not teach them how to be wives, did not teach them the importance of interdependence, did not teach them how to coexist with a man, but instead empower them to only think about themselves. And that if they were to think about relationships, it was all about from a place of entitlement. It was all about expectation. It wasn't supposed to be about responsibility. That it was about, what can a man do for you? What can a man give you? What can you extract from a man? It was all about, have a list. Go back to the sessions I did many weeks ago, and you will find that between Generation X and Generation Y, you have women who have a longer list than women who fall within Generation Z and A. Why? Because their mothers were the baby boom generation who taught them to be expectant without giving anything in return. It was all about taking. Again, we go back to the whole thing about self. It's all about how you feel. The world revolved around you and you were just supposed to take. In any case, what we saw was that the baby boom generation and the very early Generation X raised their daughters to be strong, independent, entitled, expectant, but most importantly, modern women, and to shun all of the values that came from the traditional inheritances of their forefathers. Same women raised their sons to be soft, feminine, weak, lack vision, lack a sense of purpose, and therefore almost emasculated. And part of the reason why you have this large group of single unmarried women in the UK, more than we've ever had, is partly because you have these women who have been educated. And for some reason, when we educate ourselves, there's a sense, there's a feeling that comes with as though you're in a higher social class. You know, you have a doctorate in a certain profession. It makes you feel as though you're better than other people. These women are the ones who snare at hard-working men, men who work with their hands, and men who wake up every morning, go out into the world, exchange their sweat, their tears, their blood, for the opportunity to make a difference for the next generation. The women were raised to think that their careers was important and that they were equal to men. A key part of the whole conversation today, the whole thing about you're equal to a man, so much so that they took it literally, figuratively speaking, and literally, and they demand the same attitude and expectations that men do. And what you find is these women were taught not to think about marriage, that marriage was something to hold you down, like a trap, a burden, something on your neck, and that it should be delayed as long as possible, and that joy and happiness will come from career, education, freedom, sexual liberation, and not the family. And I have never seen, and here is perhaps a sad reality as I try to get today's session to a place where I can start to close, I have never seen more unhappy women in my entire life as I have seen over the past decade. Especially women who are from about 29, going on 30, up to about 49. More unhappy women. Why? Because the installation software given to them was wrong. They left their cards on the table too long. They were told family was not important. So much so that I have seen women, mothers in that same baby boom generation snare and shame their daughters who wanted to get married early, and instead said to their daughters, you don't need to be married. Focus on your education. Focus on your career. And eventually you can pick a man when you're ready, which is a lie. The greatest lie ever told to women. The feminist movement and the feminist ideology is the greatest lie ever told to women. It's very believable, but inside that ideology is what I call unintended consequences. In theory, it sounds great. In practice, all you get is pain. And those who buy it early and who hold on to it long find that as they approach 30 and 35, they realize that not only have they sacrificed the most precious years of their fertility, beauty, opportunity, they also realize that they've achieved so much that their natural desires and their natural selection biases puts them in a position whereby they believe that they are better than men who are on the same level, isogamy, as they are, and they want to apply hypergamy, which is to marry someone above them. They want someone who is as good as they are, but preferably greater. Those men do not want older women. And so, and I say this with so much pain, you tend to find, and I'm seeing this so much more, the women in this group, when they get to 35, when they hit 35, 36, 37, they start doing it alone. They start creating families by going to sperm banks and going through, rather than create a family by planning with a man across the table from you who loves and cares and who you love and care and admire, they go for in vitro. Rather than in vivo, you have test tube babies, women choosing to start a family alone, not because there are no good men around, but because they believe that they are better than those men, and they are refusing to do what it takes to give the men what they want, which is collaboration, cooperation, getting along. These women are still entitled and too expectant that they say, no, I'll just start the family. I will go to a sperm bank and I'll start my family. And as I sit back and I look back, I say, well, this is a replay of what happened during the silent generation. A lot of the fathers died in the wars. The mothers raised their children alone. And what we've seen is this degenerate society where we're raising children with no fathers. Why? Because the mothers are just completely selfish, because they were raised to be selfish. Now, I'm going to bring today's session to a place where I think it might be useful. And here is a question for you. How do you know if you fall within the same group? I hope I have already given out the clue. It's a litmus test you can do. If you're 30 years and above, you've fallen into the range where nature starts to close down the gates very quickly. Despite how you feel, despite what you think, despite your beliefs, nature simply says, shut the gates. Beauty generally lasts about 12 years. A woman's sexual peak begins from about 18 until about 30. 12 years for beauty, which is when she should take some chips off the table, find someone of value, start a family, ideally, if she wants, but get on with life. From 30 and above, she starts to move towards what we call geriatric pregnancy, 35, high risk. But most importantly, she finds that the men in that social network are not her first choice. And those who are her first choice overlook her for a woman who is 10 years younger, for a woman who is perhaps often 5 years younger, 15 years younger, the longer she waits. So women who waited 35 to 40 and decide, I'm ready to have a family, realize that the men who are about the same age would rather have women who are 20 for various reasons. Obviously, those men are called names, called insecure, all the pejoratives and homonyms and all the insults about our preferences. In any case, women who delay find that the men they choose are not their first choices. They're not their second choices, sometimes not their third choices, because the first, second, and third choices do not want to have them. They overlook such women and then look towards women who are younger and more fertile and who are much more attractive and who are still young enough to be coachable and to get along with vision or a program. If you're 30 years and above, you fall within that group. And if you're 30 and above, you fall within that demographics of women who were failed by their mothers. The question is, what do you do about it? And how can you, despite being in that category, find fulfillment? The first is to start digging, to accept things as they are, to recognize that even those who love you often give you things such as advice, such as principles and philosophies that are wrong for you. That many a times you find that installed inside your system is an idea that is fueled by fear rather than faith. The first step is to stop digging. Forgive your parents, let go, and then seek new voices of reason. But most importantly, you have to start studying. A lot of women, 30 and above, and even before 30. Now, I don't talk much about women who are 29 and younger, because even if they have the same software installation, they still have more time to make a change. Ideally, from 27, that's when you should start making those decisions very, very quickly, because time will go very fast. But from 30 and above, it's important to recognize that you cannot have it all. You have to find someone who can tolerate you and who you can tolerate and do a deal. You cannot have it all. The standards you had at 22 cannot be the same standards and more that you have at 32. If you hold those standards, you will be single and you will remain unmarried, unfulfilled, the more you wait. A point will come where you would feel resentment against the world because nature would have closed all of its gates. The way you make a change is to accept things as they are first. See things as they are and accept them as they are. Second step, decide where you want it and how you want it to end. Third step, you need a strategy. You don't need luck or chance. You need a strategy, and that strategy begins with study. That study begins with self. Included with that study is understanding men and what we want, but most importantly, learning how to be something opposite to what you were raised to be. The word feminine women these days is seen as an insult when used. Masculine women, especially, perhaps I should have said this, the baby boom generation raised their daughters to be masculine women, which is why the women these days that I have described, that range, are more masculine than they are feminine. Why their sons are more feminine than they are masculine. A generation of softer men and harder women. Masculine women attract softer men. So look at your relationship and ask yourself a simple question. If you were dating, and if you're with someone, or even if you were married or cohabiting with someone, how would you describe your significant other? A masculine man or a feminine man? And that should tell you what you are. A feminine woman always attracts a masculine man. Now, always is a long word. Obviously, there are always exceptions. But generally speaking, femininity attracts masculinity. It doesn't always get it, but it does attract it. It welcomes it. It coexists peacefully with it. And so the first of many steps should be to audit yourself and recognize whether you are too feminine too masculine, and therefore in need of some femininity, and how you go about learning that is up to you. Number two, recognize and understand that across the table is someone. And except you're looking for a sucker, you want someone who you can get along with. But you have to understand what they want. And until you come to the table in fair exchange terms, you will find that nobody would want to be across the table from you beyond the period of sex. Now, I should have made it very clear. A lot of these women do not have an issue attracting men. But it's not what you, as the saying in finance, is not what you earn, matters is what you keep. Attraction is easy. Men are attracted to anything, like honeys to bees. Retention is the most important word. What is the quality and the caliber of good men, good masculine, strong men of value that you're able to retain? And what you find is the women that I have described go through men after men after men, but never have the ability to retain said men beyond a certain length of time. Masculine men do not want masculine women. And until women start to change and let go of some of what their mothers, the baby boom generation, gifted to them, and start to embrace the principles and the foundations and the philosophies of the silent and the great generation women, they will always fail relationally and emotionally. The reason being, I have given you the various generations. There is a consistent theme with regards to the men. Men of generation great, silent, were consistent. Yes, the baby boom generation, there weren't that many fathers, or as many fathers, due to the war. And yes, the generations that have followed, we've seen more boys raised by single mothers. However, at our very core, men are very similar, which is why a man who is more feminine can be in the presence of a group of men and very quickly understand that he lacks something, just in the same way as a masculine man can be in the presence of other men, some of which are feminine, and he can see the feminine side, and he can decide whether he believes that is lacking in himself. Let me bring today's session to a close by saying as follows. It's important as a woman or as a man to ask yourself a simple question. What do I want? Number two, what am I willing to give to get what I want? Number three, what am I willing to give up to get what I want? Number four, when will I start? Because until you start, you cannot have what you want. You have to move away from theory and living in your head and take action. Just do it. And so I would encourage women to come into relationships with a greater appreciation and awareness of how factors that predate your existence and ideologies that predate your selection of those ideologies were installed in your system, in your subconscious mind, and how you've gone through life for many years not being aware that you're running on automatic mode, but the software system, although it sounds good, is doing more harm than good. I hope today's session has been useful.